All right, let's begin again. If you could all take your seats, grab someone from outside, bring them back in. I know we've got donuts out there, so that's, I don't know, guys, you're competing with donuts. I myself got a little distracted by the donut, I have to say. Okay. All right, so let's begin again. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, we have a panel now talking about business, innovation, and people. And so we have Chris MacIntosh, who's with the Klein Innovation Center. He's the leader with IBM in Nova Scotia. So welcome, Chris. We also have Mark Osborne, who is Vice President of Human Resources of Dane Ross Transport. There you are. All right, and we also have Chris MacDonald, Director of Government Relations with JD Irving Limited, based in St. John. So welcome. Thank you, Chris. And we have Laurel, Broten, President and CEO of the Nova Scotia Business Inc., who is joining us from Halifax today. So thank you, Laurel, for coming and moderating this panel. So with that, I'll leave it to you, Laurel.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bonjour tout le monde. Je suis très ravie d'être ici avec vous aujourd'hui. As was said, I'm Laurel Broten, President and CEO of Nova Scotia Business Inc., which is a provincial crown corporation, which has the mandate to grow exports and attract investment for the province of Nova Scotia. I sit on the board of the PPF and have both a personal and professional interest in the topic here today. My family chose to move to Atlantic Canada about 5 years ago, and we couldn't be happier. We summer in Prince Edward Island. We travel often to New Brunswick because my twins play water polo, and water polo seems to loom large in New Brunswick. And we live in Nova Scotia, and I need to spend more time in Newfoundland and Labrador so I can truly boast that I'm 100% Atlantic Canadian. In my role at NSBI, I meet with both local and international companies and work to drive their growth in Nova Scotia. We partner often with other Atlantic provinces to collaborate for the good of the region. And when my team is working to attract a company to Nova Scotia to establish or grow their operations, we need to show them that they will have a workforce that will meet their needs. We have certain incentives, such as payroll rebates, that we can customize to support a company's workforce attraction activities. For example, we could increase the percentage amount of a payroll rebate so that employers can receive an extra incentive for the hiring of new graduates and new immigrants. And we offer this because immigration, as you know, because you're here today, is one of the most critical issues confronting Atlantic Canada. So I'm very pleased to be part of the team here at PPF working to move the bar forward. And let me just set the stage for the conversation that we are about to have to say that the bar is moving forward. The Atlantic Growth Strategy has created a new framework for a number of strategic initiatives, and I know you've heard about that today, and I want to give you some numbers on those new pathways for employers. So as part of the Atlantic Growth Strategy, the Immigration Pilot has created 3 new employer-driven immigration programs to help the region attract and retain skilled foreign workers and international graduates. And since the pilot launched on January 27, 2017, more than 1,000 Atlantic employers have expressed an interest in participating, and nearly 900 Atlantic employers have become eligible to recruit immigrants to fill job vacancies. As a result, more than 1,300 skilled immigrants and international graduates have been recruited and have applied for provincial endorsement. Over 1,100 have received a job offer, an individualized settlement plan, and can apply to immigrate permanently with their families. And now, to build on this success, government partners are planning more activity around a study and stay pilot, which began in Nova Scotia and now will roll out to the rest of Atlantic Canada to allow international graduates to stay in the region to work or start a business once they have graduated. So the federal and provincial governments continue to work together on targeted skills training, and much of those labor skills are being developed to match the needs of Atlantic Canadian companies. So now it comes to the companies. Government is not going it alone. We know our employers want the same thing, the ability to not only attract but to retain workers so that they have meaningful employment and their families can enjoy a meaningful and rewarding life here in Atlantic Canada, and our companies can have the skilled workforce that they need. So growth is a shared responsibility, and business is squarely at the center of the demographic challenges that Atlantic Canada continues to grapple with. We're so lucky to have 3 of Atlantic Canada's leading employers here with us today, employers who are working on the front lines of employee attraction and retention and who have generously taken time to share their stories with us today. I want to give you a bit of a synopsis of their work that they've done in this space and then get to some questions. Chris MacIntosh, Client Innovation Center leader at IBM. Chris has led the IBM Client Innovation Center in Nova Scotia since its inception in 2013, growing it from 70 employees, supporting 3 Canadian clients, to a complement of 500 people, supporting now more than 30 clients. He's a senior leader in the ICT industry with more than 20 years' experience in both the public and private sector. His team of consultants develops industry-leading IT solutions and has consistently been one of IBM's top delivery teams globally. Chris is especially proud to have employed well over 200 new graduates into their first career positions. So welcome, Chris.
Thank you.
Mark Osborne, Vice President, Human Resources, Day & Ross Transportation. Mark is responsible for advancing the Day & Ross business by providing strategic guidance in the development and deployment of talent management, professional development, championing employee and safety culture, and promotes ongoing operational excellence across the Day & Ross team. Mark has 30-plus years experience in leadership, human resources, operational safety, in commercial, industrial, and military sectors, both in Canada, internationally, and in the private and public sectors, and will provide us with a great deal of insight into Day & Ross's recruiting journey. So welcome, Mark. Chris MacDonald, Director of Government Relations, J.D. Irving Limited. Chris joined St. John Shipbuilding Limited as an in-house legal counsel in 1991. In 1995, he was transferred to SJSL's parent company, J.D. Irving Limited. In January 2004, Chris... I thought our tech team had control of it. In January 2004, Chris took on the role of Director of Government Relations for the J.D. Irving Group of Companies. Chris is a member of the Canadian Bar Association, the Law Society of New Brunswick. He's a member of the Board of Directors of the St. John Region Chamber of Commerce, and he is a former member of the Board of Directors of Enterprise St. John, the Greater St. John Community Foundation, and Sports New Brunswick. And I know he, too, will give us a great deal of insight into the journey that they have had. So I look forward to joining our team here and asking some questions. Take my mic with me. All right, so let's get to those questions. We're anxious for you to... Okay. This is a new, okay. There. We're going to hear me? Okay. Let's get to those questions now that we've stopped all the noise. Just trying to make an impact and wake you up, make sure that everybody's listening here. Okay, Chris, let's get started. I wanted to start with you today because we had a great conversation, Chris MacDonald. Great conversation yesterday. I know, 2 Chris's. It's going to be Chris 1 and Chris 2. I don't know how I'm going to do this. Chris M. Except you're both
That doesn't make
that doesn't work either. No. Chris MacDonald.
Yes.
Let's talk about the innovations in HR that your organization has implemented to recruit and retain folks to your team.
Sure, thanks Laurel. And before I get started, I just want to mention that there's a brochure that we've put together that we have Mary Keith, our VP of Communications, has those at the back of the room. So this is just an information brochure on the type of things that we're doing from an immigration perspective. So you may find it of interest, some background information. I'm going to touch on some of the points that are in there as well. I'd say, Laurel, right off the bat, one of the innovations that we've done is we actually have a person whose title is Director of Immigration. So this is a person by the name of Susan Wilson, and I should say that Susan should be here today, and would be here today, but she's traveling, and because she is the guru in our organization on immigration. But I wanted to highlight that point because I don't think there's very many other companies that actually have a position called Director of Immigration, and that's only 6 months old for us. But I think what it does is it highlights the importance of immigration to our organization and where we see things going into the future. I should also mention from an HR perspective, we are creating, for the first time ever, an Immigration Center of Excellence, and this is all about attracting and retaining immigrants. So that's something we have in the works right now. And we're doing a number of innovative initiatives for newcomers that we haven't done in the past, but it goes to show you the type of things that our organization and many others are doing to make sure the settlement process works. And so, for instance, we have an International Buddy Day. So if you're from a certain country and you come over, they hook you up with somebody else that was from that same country. We also have an International Employee Dinner, so for immigrants and their spouse, the newcomer and their spouse. That happens once a year. There's actually an international Facebook page, so folks can connect with one another on Facebook. And so these are some of the items we're doing. I know many other companies are doing many other items and similar items, but it's all about how do we get the people here and how do we keep them? And there's been so much talk about the settlement process, and it is so important, and I know we'll talk about it further, but those are kind of some of the key items that we're doing.
Great, thank you. Now, Chris MacIntosh, tell us about IBM's Client Innovation Center. 2013 opens up, journey since then. I've had the privilege to walk and visit you on that floor. You know, an incredible diversity and international team that you've built there.
It truly is. Diversity is at the heart of everything where IBM's focused and our belief in it. Our president and chairman of the board actually this year, she began to refer to our focus as going beyond just diversity to more of a model of inclusion. And that's what we've got in our work team now. Last year I had an opportunity for the first time in our international community. We have a global head of focusing on minority females and trying to bring them into leadership positions. And she ran her first workshop outside the US in our center last year. And she was amazed when she came up, and we brought in, I think there was 140 females from our team that were focused on moving into leadership roles. And they were minority females, and they represented 43 separate countries around the world. Our focus is building on that. And one of the keys to achieving that is our workforce. We knew we couldn't grow a high-quality ICT team with experienced hires down here. You could hire some, but you had to build your talent from the ground up. So we were very focused on early professional hires, hiring straight from schools, partnering with the schools, and today I'm actually at 540 staff, and I checked when I came in today, 270 of my staff joined the center as an early professional. And of those, 110 of them came as international students. So we're very focused on building that program. The Nova Scotia Office of Immigration was very focused with us. They were very supportive of what we were doing. And it was that whole model of thinking about diversity up front, thinking about that made our team better, and it made it a much stronger team. That's why there are 9 of these nearshore delivery centers like I have, based all in G7 type countries around the world, like ourselves. We are the largest and now the most successful in any of those other centers. And it's because I think of our focus on diversity and our focus on bringing in that early professionals and those international students.
Great, thank you. Mark, Day & Ross has an exciting journey, an interesting path. I think you're one of the first businesses in New Brunswick to hire immigrant workers under the AIP program. And you had to adjust your own HR processes a little bit to do that. So tell us about that journey.
Well, thanks, Laurel. We did. And one of the things we recognize, much like Chris and Chris have recognized, is there's a great opportunity to bring skilled employees into our workforce. And we have some tough to fill jobs, that, particularly on the IT center. So when we looked at how we were in recruiting, we had to change some of the things we were doing, much like Chris talked to JDI. What they did is, with the Director of Immigration, we've actually licensed 2 of our employees on my team to be able to work through the immigration process for permanent residencies for those that we've brought in. So we worked with the New Brunswick government and the AIPP program to be able to streamline that process and dedicate one person from my team to be able to take them through that process, help them get through their medical certification before they actually get approved, their language testing, all of those things, and walk them through. And we also work with the business partners to develop that settlement process. How do they connect with community services? How do they connect with agencies that will help them find housing and transportation, all those sorts of things? How do they find schools, a doctor, all of it? We invested and built budgets for each one of the employees that we brought in as part of the immigration program to make sure that they're funded. So simple things like when you first get your first apartment or your house and you're renting it, how do you put groceries and cleaning supplies in there? So we fund those kinds of things. So we looked at all of that process to help them get settled. And then we actually have someone on the whatever team that we're actually hiring them onto. We make sure that there's someone who is of a diverse nature that looks like the immigrant that we're bringing in, so that they have a comfort level. So we've changed those processes to make sure we try to make it a little more friendly and let them understand, particularly in New Brunswick, it's a very rural environment, and make sure that they're comfortable settling in. And we have touch points with them. We at the end of their first week, much like Chris described, we have a dinner with all of the team and diverse community. We bring in diverse community leaders to be able to do that. So that's kind of how we try to change our process that we wouldn't necessarily do for everybody. But the lesson we took from that is, why weren't we doing that for everybody else?
Some good advice on the nuts and bolts and the daily realities of things that an employer might need to get involved in to be able to recruit and retain.
Yeah, my perspective was, I grew up in a military family, and I spent 23 years in the Canadian Army, moved around all the time. So my wife and my son would have to reintegrate into a new community every time they moved. So I took that sort of experience and tried to apply into the immigration sort of model and this scenario that they would be going through.
Great, great. Chris MacIntosh, we talked yesterday about some of the challenges and some of the exciting things, but some of the challenges and how do we position? What's your advice on how do we position Atlantic Canada for success?
It's a challenge, and to part of the challenge is trying to compete with Toronto. You know, and especially in a lot of the community.
How many people in this room moved away from Toronto?
Yeah.
A lot. Look at, don't be Toronto.
Yeah, but it is different than Toronto. And one of the things when we first started, I began to attempt to recruit, going to Toronto for job fairs. Yeah. And you would visit a Toronto job fairs, and it's filled with new immigrants arriving. But truthfully, so many of them have already got a taste and love and desire to be in Toronto. We tried to recruit them down here, and they all said how much they wanted to come to Nova Scotia and how interested they were to get here. But I think I lost 50% of them within the first year, because the draw of Toronto, and once they began to get the skills that they needed, they went back. So we've really learned how to be very specialized. You know, one young lady I recruited out of Toronto, and when I was talking to her at the job fair, and I selected her to come down, the key reason wasn't her technical skills, but she talked to me about how she wanted to surf. She had actually moved from India, she moved to Australia for a while. Well, I explained to her she can surf in Nova Scotia. I did explain to her it involved a wetsuit versus a bathing suit, but she came down and she loved it. Right? So I began to learn to be very, very selective in who I'm going to get from people that are in Toronto. You can't get the general group, because you're getting a lot of people that say yes because they want a job, but they'll spend all their time when they're down here on their first job trying to get one back. So it's really getting the underpinning and building the interest. I recruited another gentleman and got him to come down here, and I asked him why he wanted to come, and he explained to me about how he had traveled Nova Scotia the year before, and the feeling of inclusion and the feeling of being pulled into the community. That's what is making the difference. So look for the underpinnings of the real draw that's going to keep them.
It's interesting how the conversation that as employers we're having right now is so tied to the last conversation about getting connected to community, retaining. Certainly in, talking to our clients at NSBI, we hear from many of them, that it is, the lack of community connections that results in a family, even with a good employment, choosing to move somewhere else. So, Chris, can we talk about that, Chris MacDonald, about that retention issue?
Yeah.
You're investing a lot. How do you retain?
Yeah, and maybe I'll do that in relation to one of the initiatives we've got on the way for the village of Chipman. So we've got a sawmill in Chipman. We've brought in 4 immigrants to date, but it just goes to show you how things are changing there. The village of Chipman has a person now working for them that is responsible for settlement. The village of Chipman. They have 1,100 people, and they have an employee that's responsible for settlement. We have somebody that's responsible for settlement in that area, one of our HR folks. And so it highlights that how things have changed and what needs to be done. And I think, touching on, if I could, Laurel, about, it's a little bit, St. John and Halifax are one thing, Chipman's a different situation, right? And so there's different challenges, and one of the things we're dealing with right now is, for instance, we need more people in Chipman, and so a situation that you may not run up against in St. John or Halifax would be housing, right? So if you need 40 people in the village of Chipman, just as an example, where do you put them? And so we're actually in conversations with the provincial government, with the village of Chipman, with how do we do that? How do we go forward, because they have to have a place to live. Obviously, we want to make it welcoming to them. But this is a whole new area that, quite frankly, we haven't had to deal with before from a typical recruitment process, is actually worrying about, okay, but where are they going to live? And we need to worry about that. That's got to be our worry. And I think it really tees up with the villages and the cities and towns that you're going to put these people in, and with the provincial and federal governments. And I'm going to do this now just because I don't want to forget, but Rob Kelly and the folks at Petal are tremendous. Like, the work we've done with that organization and the dedication from that organization and IRCC, and everybody has been on side with it. And I just wanted to mention that they're involved in all these projects. They're doing everything they can to help us. And I think we want to make sure that they're recognized for the work that they're doing here in the province.
Great. Let's talk about spouses, because you had an interesting story that we talked about with respect to the recruitment of spouses.
Well, I think it's important that when we talk about when you're bringing in an immigrant to work for you, you need to look beyond just that individual worker's coming and their welfare. What about their family, their spouse? So we had a gentleman that we actually were able to successfully, under the AIPP program, to be able to bring in someone from Cuba in our IT department. And it just so happens is we asked him and said, what does your wife do, before they came? Said, and what type of roles do you have? And would she interested in working when she came? And so we interviewed, and it turns out a great fit. So now we got 2 for 1, if you will. We were able to get the IT specialist that we needed, and at the same time find employment for his spouse. So, it was a win-win on both sides. And this, to the point about retention, now you've got 2 people who are embedded now into the community because they've got some stability.
Great. One of the things that we talked about as we were preparing for the panel was the fact that all of your businesses, enterprises have committed significant resources to this, and you're seeing success. What is your advice to us, to government, to the PPF, when it comes to smaller employers? You know the journey that you've walked as larger employers. I mean, what would the advice be as to how can we support smaller employers that are also trying to go down this path?
Well, if I can make a comment, I mean, we talked about this before we came up on the panel, and I looked around the room and I looked at the brochure, and what struck me is there's not enough private business represented in this forum. Lots of great government services and the like that provide all the support and the programs and are great partners for us in the endeavor we're going down the road with this. But we need to get more businesses involved with this. Our parent company, McCain Foods, and Scott McCain have talked about getting more businesses involved in this kind of forum. So I think it becomes fundamentally important. And I think the other thing they need to do is And I know both Chris and Chris are doing the same thing in our organization, is develop a diversity and inclusion sort of network and educate and train our people. Day & Ross is the largest transportation LTL company in all of Canada. We have a footprint, not a large footprint in Atlantic Canada, but from coast to coast. But in Atlantic Canada and Quebec, we have 50% of all of our workforce lies in those 5 provinces. So it's important to understand the cultural dynamic and invest in those things and really promote that kind of thing. But if you don't understand the cultural differences as you bring in immigrants into the workforce, if you don't educate the leaders to how to deal with the new immigrant and the struggles they're going to go through, then you're going to miss something along the way, I believe.
Chris MacIntosh, thoughts about that, about your workforce, about challenges on making sure inclusion succeeds?
Yeah, coming back to that, also that broader-based community, I think that's also been part of our historic strength in the Atlantic provinces. Is most of us are very community-based. We're very focused on, the Halifax Chamber of Commerce concept of all ships rise. It's by business working together, and we need to collaborate together to drive this whole concept. And I think most business people will support the concept that immigration is positive for our business, and getting us to have that view and helping to embrace. So I do agree that I look at this forum, having more business directly engaged here, and the people in this forum reaching out to help to get the business consolidated in and viewing it, because we all see the same problem. Every one of us understand that, and it's part of our, we're larger business, but we'll happily share the knowledge of what we've gained with small or medium business through any forum to do that. And I've been out in many of these circuits to talk about the concept, and I think it's so critical. So the broad, more inclusive, the better.
Great.
Yeah, Laura, what I'd say, a couple of points. I think it's an absolute challenge for the small and medium-sized enterprises, and maybe that's one of the reasons why, quite frankly, there's not as much representation. And I can say we're a relatively large organization. We're going to do 8,800 hires in the next 3 years, and 5,100 of those will be in New Brunswick. And so we have a director of immigration. We have lots of HR folks. But if you're a company that has 5 employees and you need 5 more, for instance, getting through that whole process, I think they've made leaps and bounds, through the AIPP and other sources to make it more efficient. But it's still daunting, I think, to a lot of small and medium-sized companies. So there's a couple of things. I think certainly the governments are moving in the right direction, making it more efficient. I think there's still improvements that can be made there. And I also think there's one particular aspect we see. We can, like I said, as in New Brunswick as an example, 5,100 hires. We know exactly who we need, when we need it, basically. We can do those things. Most small companies can't. And I think there is actually a role that can be played by government in assisting small and medium employers to understand exactly what their needs are. And it sounds kind of simple, but it isn't that simple in the timing of those needs. And it's something the bigger companies can do, but I think it's really hard for the small companies to understand when they need people, how many they need, and I think there's a role for government to play there.
I can say from the companies that we've worked with who are our clients, you in a smaller enterprise, your CEO or your CFO are trying to tackle this issue from the corner of their desk as they continue to administer their entire operation or production line. And in smaller communities, you have, how are you going to get the language training? How are you going to get the housing? How are you going to get the spot? You don't have any public transit. I mean, the list is long to the issues that you need to tackle.
Right.
So just a show of hands, how many folks in the room are representative of employers? So that will be our work to do. I'm anxious to get some questions, especially perhaps from those who are in the space who do settlement services work. But I just want to go back around before we open it up for some questions and get your top thing that surprised you. What surprised you about trying to tackle this issue? Maybe there's a nod here. Maybe I'll start here.
Yeah, I think that the biggest thing that surprised me was the length of time it took to actually go through the entire, to Chris's point, to go through the process. It's the AIPP is a great program. It talks about when we first joined at the outset about fast tracking to permanent residency. That's all good, but at the end of the day, the process will still take you 9 to 10 months, because there are things you can't control in the process, either on this side of the ocean or in here. But there are things that they have to do in their home country around medical, and how long it takes to get that certification done, how long language testing, all those sorts of things have to be done. So that's what really surprised me about it. I guess I was hoping it would be a little quicker. Still effective, but I think we need to find a way to streamline that. That's what struck me as the biggest one.
Chris MacIntosh.
Actually, but my surprise is going to be a positive surprise. About 6 months after we opened the center, the Temporary Foreign Workers Program hit the front page of the newspaper. It ultimately became a positive for us because it became a good ability for us to recruit into our team. But there was one group that was very negatively impacted by that. There's more than one, but one that was not an intended consequence. And that was the students that were coming in a graduate visa process, and where they were entering the workplace and they had 12 months to gain the required points to become permanent residents. We had, in IBM across Canada, we had about 250 students that were caught and had got employment with us, and they were going to be ready to become PRs. 50 of them were in my center, 200 of them were in Toronto, or in Ontario in our IBM labs. The 200 in Ontario, at the end of that 12 months, lost their employment and went home. The 50 in Nova Scotia stayed. And it was the support of the Office of Immigration here that made it work. So that was a very positive surprise, and it demonstrates what we can do with the community and making it work.
Great. Chris MacDonald.
Very much the same as what Mark said. I think that the entire process we knew, I think, was complicated. Everybody was a little bit maybe surprised at how long it's taken. I think, once again, there's been progress made. And I think the other piece that may have surprised folks is just how much is involved in the settlement piece of the equation and the retention piece, because it's, we recruit out of Ontario all the time, and exactly what Chris said, if they're from the Maritimes, you got a good chance of keeping them. If they're not from the Maritimes, they'll likely go back. That's been our experience. But this is a different situation, right? This is, different culture, different in that whole settlement process, and making sure they're welcomed in different language. That's a very complicated, very time-consuming, and needs to be done. Right?
So we talked a little bit about some of the challenges, but I do want to, these are success stories. You have success stories. So give us the story of one of those success stories. I know I've had the chance to meet some of your success stories, Chris MacIntosh. So just share with the audience, because they're such heartwarming stories, the life-changing impact of immigrating and getting a great role.
Yeah. Well, I have one that stands out. I have lots of them, but one that stands out to me above all of them. When we first got started, we had to begin some work in a very specialized technical SAP. It's SAP system, but it was a cloud-based infrastructure. And I needed to bring in a senior technical architect that could lead our activity. None of them existed in the country. We went to India and we found one working for IBM. I brought him as a temporary foreign worker. At the end of his duration with us, he was eligible for permanent residency, and I managed to convince him to stay with us over top of offers to move to IBM in Toronto and also to competitors in Toronto. And he went home to India, got married, brought his wife back with him. He's now leading, he's our lead technical architect on our team. His wife has now joined our employment because I agree with that same concept. Wherever we can, we try to bring in spouses because it helps to keep them with us. And last week he became a Canadian citizen, so it was really a key one.
Yeah, those are very wonderful life experiences to be able to share with someone the day they're becoming Canadian citizens. So, stories?
Well, I guess I'd like to, because I'm not involved in the immigration files on a day-to-day basis, I guess, Laurel, maybe I'll take the chance, I'll digress for a second to talk about, you know, I guess what Herb talked about and what Frank talked about, I thought was quite interesting about what's the issue here, really. And I think I actually agree with both of them. And I think one thing we've looked at is this is a whole suite of issue. I think it's important to talk about this issue because immigration is really, really important, but it is one facet of our entire recruitment process, right? So we have a whole thing about keep them home, grow at home, make it home, right? You know, this whole idea that it starts, you know, with keeping the folks that you have, with recruiting, you know, from outside, bringing them in, both from Canada and elsewhere. And one of the things that we are actually advancing as a concept is a pilot project where we can think about it from this perspective. What we're finding is a mismatch of skill sets that are required by the employer and what the employee is coming to us. Why do we have unemployment in New Brunswick, yet we need 25,000 people? So just quickly, concept being, can we line those two up? Can we do a pilot project in New Brunswick? And something we've advanced, and we've talked to Petal about it. They're quite interested in it. We've talked to ESDC about it. But the whole concept that, similar to what we done in Nova Scotia with Women Unlimited and putting 20 women through a welding program in Nova Scotia, can we match up those skill sets? And what I mean by that is employers have needs, whether it's truck drivers, electricians, and hypothetically, if you need 10 electricians, could you put them through a community college course where there's a job at the end of the day, right? But it's not as simple as saying, here's free tuition. It needs to be an entire suite of a program. So one of the thoughts we had was the EI program, it's got $1 billion surplus. Could money be taken out of that for a pilot in New Brunswick, where you would take that money, you would take the unemployed individuals, you would take underemployed individuals, you would pay them the EI rate, you would pay for their tuition, you would put them through the course, you would have employers lined up to hire them, and we matched those up. And it sounds really simple, but I don't really believe it's happening today. And it's something that I know we've been working hard at. We're hoping to get it lined up, but if you could do a pilot, and Angelique talked about how we were nimble, and New Brunswick is a small province, and we can do these types of things. I think this is a great opportunity to do something like that. And it sounds simple, but I don't see it really happening out there today. We have needs, but we don't necessarily, we do a lot of this stuff ourselves, but if you could have a success story there and then broaden it out and more employees, I think there's a real opportunity. So I'm not really answering your question, but I wanted to make sure we actually touched on that, right?
I think the issues of underemployed, of inclusion,
right.
of making sure that there's opportunity for young people and bringing new people to our part of the world are all part of the same thing. They're all issues that we need to tackle. We want more people to be here. We want to create that opportunity, and we want people to be able to come and take advantage of that opportunity. But you're right, it is a whole suite of services that have to go around those initiatives to make sure that
it's
people
daycare,
can
right,
once
too.
they,
You know, you take a look at what we did in Nova Scotia. You can't just simply say, well, you got free tuition, Bob's your uncle. The women that went through that program, a lot of them were single moms. So they're not going to do that unless they've got daycare, you know, so it's not that simple. It is a suite, and you need to provide it all. We're doing the exact same thing with our Pathways to Shipbuilding program now on the Aboriginal side. We're putting 20 people through. It's that type of thing that I think we can do in New Brunswick as well, and we're looking at, but I think that's the future. That's where we need to
I think there's some very good examples that we in Atlantic Canada can look to in other parts of Canada, in particular and the attachment of women to the labor force.
Absolutely.
Having served as Minister of Women's Issues, I know a lot of those programs, and I think there's some tools that we can take from those. I want to hear a good story, something that touched your heart about
It's
bringing
funny,
folks in.
So just before Christmas time, one of our workers that we had immigrated from India, brought his family with him. So and he had 2 young daughters, and so just before Christmas time, I think it was on the 22nd or 23rd of December. My wife and I are in the grocery store in Woodstock, and there's Manish and his wife and 2 daughters. And the 2 daughters are in their parka and they're running around. And suddenly I said, how are you? And this was about a day before a big storm hit, I think on the 22nd. And I said, how are you enjoying Canada? And they said, oh, we love it. We got our new parkas. They said, we can't wait for it to snow. And I sort of chuckled because about a week later, they got about 4 feet of snow sitting in them. So I called them up after New Year's and I said, so how did your daughters like the snow? And they said they liked it for about 20 minutes.
Let's look at some of the questions that are coming up on Slido here. Getting 14 thumbs up. Would you share your toolboxes for newcomer employees onboarding? A repository of best practices would be very beneficial to other employees. I know that probably you don't have it in a format that's shareable at this point, but if we work together and collected that information, is there an openness to help us get something like that together?
Certainly, absolutely.
Yeah, I don't think there's any issue there at all.
Okay. That's for our PPF team to put on our to-do list, I think, working with you. How do we get more businesses involved in immigration diversity issues? How might the approach be different for small and medium-sized enterprises?
Well, let me tell you what we're doing is, so Day and Ross, the way our workforce is structured, we have our salaried employees who work in our docks and in our information centers, our customer care centers, but on the other side of their business, our drivers, probably we have 2,400 roughly what we call owner-operator drivers. So we contract with them. So some of them have 2 and 3 different trucks, or sometimes up to 10 trucks. And so they're looking for help all the time to get drivers who are from, let's say, Northern Europe, who've got experience driving in winter conditions, to come into their business, and but they don't have the ability to sponsor. Simply because they don't have the tools, they're not aware of the program, they don't have the time, they're running a business. So what we've done is we've partnered with them and by setting up licensed immigration coordinators within our teams, and we walk them through the process and how they have to invest in it. So I think, Chris, you talked about a little bit about how do we help those medium-sized businesses. Yeah. So I think what we did in this model is we actually said, if you want our assistance, for a flat fee, we'll take care of all of that stuff on your behalf. And so we just turned it into a service that all of our owner-operators can use. They don't have to invest in the training and everything, they're just buying that service. So that might be a way to get through it.
I also think for some of the small to medium is working, we're happy to partner with some of the industry groups. So in Nova Scotia, in ICT, we have Digital Nova Scotia. You have Halifax Partnership. You have Halifax Chamber of Commerce, right? And going broader across the communities. I think getting those groups involved, and we'll happily be engaged to help to explain, share, that would be a spot where we could share our toolkit of how to make it work through those teams.
Great. Okay, next question on Slido. Have you had to increase local wages and or working conditions in order to retain people?
Good question. I can't say I can answer that at the end of the day. It depends on the particular positions you're going into, I would think. Certainly we've had to, once again, change our approach to how do we retain the individuals. I think one of the factors that always goes in, because I was asked the question today about wages, and it's easy to say, well, just raise your wages and you're going to get people. Obviously, that's not how business works at the end of the day. There's a certain threshold that you can hit, and then you're not in business anymore. And what we're finding, and I think this is, Herb touched on this, and some other speakers have as well, is there's certain areas, and us being in the forest industry, for instance, there's some folks just don't want to do that type of work anymore, right? And that's life, right? So where is in Romania or Ukraine, and that's where we're recruiting for those positions today, for instance, they're interested in doing those jobs and interested in coming here and interested in maintaining or improving their standard of living, and we provide that here in Canada, right? So I don't have any specific examples of where I would know that wages have changed. Certainly, I think it would depend on the particular area you're in, right?
Chris?
In our case, the answer is no. We're recruiting and bringing people here, and I'm very clear, I'm not going to, it's really messaging and explaining to people that living in a community like Halifax or anywhere in the land of Canada, it's a different cost of living to living in Toronto. So it's really helping, or living in central Canada somewhere, because that's where the competition more often is coming from. And so, you know, that's actually part of our offer is if you want to have a better standard of living and you can live here and have a living wage at a more reasonable level wage. So the answer is no, I'm actually not finding a significant, we pay fairly, and I build a team which is based around a model of career velocity. As they move their careers forward, they get more opportunities.
Yeah, we're the same. And to be competitive to get talent into our business across the country, you're not going to pay someone who lives in, let's say, Saskatoon, the same thing for the same job that you're going to pay someone in Toronto. But you need to be market competitive. So you need to have a compensation strategy, but you don't. So you're not being reactive. You're going to attract and retain talent. You have to have a compensation strategy for each region, so you are competitive, including from an equity point of view.
A couple of the questions that are up on Slido talk about how do we get more businesses involved, and maybe I kick it off by saying, how do we get more businesses involved by having them understand the success that they will have of being involved in an initiative like this one. Any other thoughts about how we can get more businesses in this room, more businesses to engage in this conversation?
I think, Laurel, it's a lot. I'll go back to what I kind of said before. I think the process is daunting for a lot of them, and I think the easy answer is, if I can't find somebody in New Brunswick, I don't look at, I think that's got to change, right? And in order to do that, they have to understand the system and the supports that are there. So if I need 10 people, I'm not getting them, I posted for a month, is there government assistance there, like from a PEDAL or from a COA or from IRCC that will say, okay, we've got somebody that can help you source locally, nationally, internationally, where those jobs are required. And I think it's an education piece largely, really.
Anybody else on that?
Yeah,
on that topic?
I would agree. It is an education piece. It's getting businesses to understand the business impact and the ROI by having a diverse workforce. If they understand that and take that from the conceptual part to Chris's point, and how do you actually get them the tools to be able to understand that having a diverse workforce can actually, there's an actual, I think it's about more, you're 15% more to the bottom line if you're more diverse.
Yeah.
And to get them to understand that.
And I think the other thing we need to understand is it's not only a challenged reality here. It is in large parts of the world, there is an all hands on deck. Sure. We compete with jurisdictions when we are seeking to attract investment that have entire crown type entities that recruit and train and help employers find their workforce. That's not the model that we have, but we need to find a way to support small employers, large employers to be able to do that because it benefits all of us. Okay, here's another question. Will the Irving Immigration Center of Excellence be accessible for other businesses, and what does it involve?
It's really an internal process that's in works right now, and certainly it's aimed once again at providing the necessary resources for our internal folks from an HR perspective and so on and so forth. I don't believe, Mary may be able to answer the question if there's any intent to make that completely accessible. I don't know if you know the answer to that question, Mary. I don't think at this stage that there's any intent to do that, but certainly something we could look at once it's up and running for sure.
Great. I think we have about 4 minutes left here. So what made you realize you had to do business differently to integrate newcomers into the workplace? Anybody on that one? kind of covered it about.
Yeah, we started with that belief, so that was from the base of building the places. It was required. In the ICT industry, this is critical to the way of being successful.
One of the questions that was up earlier that I think is maybe fallen down but deserving of an answer is what sectors and what industries can, as we talk about wanting to get more employers involved, it was what sectors and what industries could participate in this. And I guess I just wanted to say from the privileged role that I have to work with all sorts of businesses across the province of Nova Scotia, all businesses, from industry in rural community to the IT to the high tech to artificial intelligence. It runs the gamut. I think you would agree that there's no industry that wouldn't benefit from more diversity and more workforce.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Yep.
Okay, let's do a rapid round of last thoughts. Anything that you think this audience should know, a call to action for more employers, or things that you'd like to share with the group?
Last comment is just reiterate that I think everybody's learning through this process right now, and kudos to the federal and provincial governments for taking the time and putting the resources to it. I think, in particular, what Francis is bringing into the ACOA element of this is extremely helpful. Once again, Rob Killing, the folks at Pedal, everybody, we're learning, right? We're all learning through this process. Everybody's trying to do it better and more efficient. And I think in the long run, the better we get at it, the folks that come behind us and the small and medium-sized enterprises that follow behind us, this will be helpful for them as well, right? Because the process will get more efficient. So I think overall, a lot of good work is happening, right?
Great. Chris.
Yeah. In our case, in the thinking of just making sure we don't lose sight, and I'm glad I've heard a lot of conversation today about the education element, because that's such a critical component, and partnering with the post-secondary schools and the international students and having that all integrated into a single process is so critical.
Great. Last word to you.
Thank you. And I think the one thing I would say is just the process can be daunting if you're a small business, and that. What I would say is if you've got 75% of the plan done, don't think you have to have a perfect plan. Just get going, and you'll learn along the way, and that's fine. It's okay to stub your toe. That's how you learn.
Great. Well, thank you, Chris, and Mark. Thank you for sharing your stories. It was a great conversation.
Thank you.
Great, and thank you, Laurel. Thanks so much. All right. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Chris. See you, Chris. Thanks. All right. Okay. So thank you so much. That was an excellent discussion. So many great ideas. So we've come close to the end of our day, and I want to thank all of you for being here. So we're just going to wrap up. I guess what I want to reflect on a little bit is just sort of here's what I'm noticing. As I said earlier today, I've been in a lot of these conversations for the last 3 years in my role with the New Brunswick Business Council, and here's what I'm noticing. Herb started us off with a really good question today: is what problem are we trying to solve? And there is sort of this chicken and egg of immigration and economics, and this idea of a small open economy. And I think Chris iterated it very well, is that we've got sort of two things on the go here that and one is not going to solve the other, that we have to work on these things in tandem. So we had some different points of view, but I think at the end of the day, I think we're both are right. I thought Kelly was, in terms of debunking some of our myths, every time we have those conversations, there's always something new to be learned. And so I'm noticing that those kinds of conversations, we're getting a little bit more open to realizing our own blind spots, as Alex had put it. Noticing that we're all sort of now, we know what the issues are. I'm feeling a real shift towards the need to move towards action and solution, that we recognize the complexity of the systems. But I love what Mark just said, is 75% go. We're not going to have it perfect. And as Chris said, we are all learning from this together. And so what I'm noticing is a lot more, a more feeling that we're in this together and we're going to find the solutions together. One of my highlights from the day was to hear Esti's experience. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting, there was an immigration summit that was held by the province of New Brunswick, and just the diversity of people that were there was excellent. And it really made me laugh when Justin said, I always get the question, oh, you must be from here originally, or a family brought you here, or a job brought you here. I think one of the things that we could do personally is every time that we meet someone who is new to Atlantic Canada, to stop asking, why are you here? So for all of us Atlantic Canadians, we have to stop asking that question. We've got to turn it around and say, you are so lucky to be here. You're going to love it here. That should be the first thing out of our mouths. And so because you saw, I saw the joy in Esti's face. I saw it today, and I have to say that was one of the big highlights for me today. And I also want to acknowledge the direct presence of folks from the federal government, Marta, Paul McKinnon. Minister Hussein is the minister that I have seen in Atlantic Canada the most in my 25 years in the private sector. And so things like the Atlantic Immigration Pilot Program and the Atlantic Growth Strategy, I feel like, for someone who's lived in this region and sort of been an active in the community, I just feel like we're supported in our challenges and our work. So I can't thank you enough for those people who have come to work with us on some of our challenges. I feel like we are part of national issues, not working necessarily on our own. And from the two panels this afternoon, just as I mentioned earlier, really moving to action. We are starting to share with one another really what are those tangible ideas? What are those things that are working and that we can share with one another? So in closing, sort of three key things: economy, private sector, and personal. And to start with the economy, Herb did challenge us on what's that problem that we're trying to solve. And Saskatchewan came up a few times today, and I know there's probably some people in the room who are laughing right now because I always go back to this Saskatchewan example. And part of it was vision for what Saskatchewan was becoming. And I think one of the things in Atlantic Canada is that the World Economic Forum says that those countries that consistently lead in competitiveness, it's those countries where the private sector leads and creates a vision based on the assets that exist. And so alignment of government education around these focus areas is really key. And so when we can see who we are becoming from an Atlantic Canadian perspective and we work together on that, that's where I feel we can really be successful, and we will be the Saskatchewan story of tomorrow. In terms of the private sector, the second area I wanted to focus on that really stood out today is this need for private sector to be in the conversation. And I have to say that I've actually seen that improve, and it's one of the things that came out really clearly with the Economic Immigration Lab, is that is one of our key challenges. And I'm starting to see that shift. But there's some real work there. And the commitment that I want to make, and it's my offer to anyone who'll work with me, in my role at the Business Council, anyone who wants to collaborate and work with us, then I commit today to, when we're talking with the employers here about sharing that toolkit, let's create that platform for private sector companies to come together. And one of the things, that was brought up is about we are a small business-based economy, and so we really need to work out some of those solutions. And I know Rob Kelly and his team, some of the things is that a lot of companies can't afford those human resources capacity inside their organization. But there's a real opportunity we have a lot of independent HR consultants in Atlantic Canada that work on their own, and they themselves are small business owners. And that's a real opportunity for those human resources consultants to really develop their own practice to be available to small business in order to help create some of those opportunities and those linkages. So, and Francis challenged us, this morning, is that the private sector, those companies have to ramp up and they have to invest. And another thing that the private sector can be doing is to be a louder voice in some of the commentaries, some of the conversation around immigration. So share the story of what you're doing and what your challenges are. And often it feels like that's a voice that's missing. And finally, one of the other things is universities are really working, and community colleges are really working hard to create experiential learning opportunities for students. And so I would challenge universities and private sector is to ensure that we have a mix of students who are from the region, from Canada, but also create those opportunities, because only by linking international students to the opportunities that are here will we be able to retain and attract them. So universities and community colleges are really, we had a question from a gentleman from the New Brunswick Community College. So how private sector companies, think about where you can create co-op and internship programs and make those available for all students to connect them here to the region. And so finally, just on the third level, it was sort of that personal level, and that's the level I'd like to close on, is that one of the things when Amanda spoke about the Economic Immigration Lab, it's really about citizen-led action. And so my plea would be is, there's one of the things that the lab is doing is looking for teams that have an idea and have a project and want to test it out, and that want to find other people that are just as passionate about solving that same problem as they are. And so I would really encourage anyone who's interested to be in touch and to bring their solution and their idea into the lab. But then also, today I thought it was really interesting. There were a lot of times I found myself reflecting on how personally we can each take action. And it was Nancy that talked about walking through the glass wall. So I guess my challenge to myself and to each one of you is that how do we extend that hand and help someone walk through that glass wall? Either through our schools, our children are in schools, be involved with the ONB Connects program. Local chambers are doing great mentorship programs. Reach out and ask if they can be that introduction point for you. Start a fun Friday hour in your community. And I love Angelique's idea as well, is just invite someone to come with you to, if it's open mosque evening, neighborhood events, spouses, cultural events, those kinds of things. So if we could all reflect here today about how we bring others along, because as Angelique said, we are all likely the converted. So Ed started out today by saying that we had green shoots, that there's often, we start out with the economists, which typically brings you all the bad stats, and we all know that situation. But I would say that we, after hearing today and, hearing the experiences, the ideas, and the energy, that what we have here is more than green shoots. I think we've got a lot of promise, and we've got a lot more growth happening here than I think we give ourselves credit for. So the conversation, as I said, moved really today for me to action and solutions. So when it comes to policy direction and the work that the Public Policy Forum is doing here, I think the Public Policy Forum is in a really unique place to bring us together from an Atlantic perspective. And while there's been some collaboration, I think there's more opportunity for more. We're trying to solve this revitalization problem together, and I really think that the Public Policy Forum has, by being here today, is playing that role. But in their work here over the next 3 years with this project, is in that unique position to really bring all of the stakeholders together and look at this from an Atlantic focus. I think as well, around, in terms of policy direction, is this idea of engaging the private sector. And I think there's a little bit more myth debunking to do there. And one of the other policy questions that I think would be really interesting to explore is Herb brought up this morning about a low wage structure in Atlantic Canada. And I think he was speaking, for the entire region. And there was a question in the last panel with regards to sort of cheap, have you had to change your wages? And most people said, no, we try to sell the notion of a lower cost of living. But I think from a policy perspective, I think it would be really interesting to get underneath that question a little bit more. Francis started out this morning by saying that we were our advantage had always been sort of low labor costs. And I think we've got to get ourselves out of that thinking as well from a private sector perspective. And there was actually other research that was done by ACOA that was brought to my attention. It was done back in 2012, and they looked at the business culture in Atlantic Canada. And often where other jurisdictions move to innovation to address customer needs, often in Atlantic Canada, something that stood out is that we often move to price reduction. And so I think from a policy perspective, it'd be really interesting to explore that idea about how do we move from this low wage structure and move into more of looking about how do we compete on other ways other than always defaulting to looking at a lower price or a lower wage structure. So that would be an interesting question as well. And finally, I think Justin raised an excellent point around social license. And I think that is probably, when I think about the work that we need to do from here, I mentioned the personal piece, I mentioned the private sector and the economic level. But I think that there is, in the CRA research to say that 60% of Atlantic Canadians would think that we need same or less. I think that's where a big part of our work rests over the next couple of years, is to carry this conversation beyond sort of convention centers. And we saw some great ideas, Heather from the Dreamweavers, about how do we bring this into schools? How do we make that next generation help us? We did it on the environment. We can do it on this issue as well. We went right to the kids, and the kids trained us all on how to save the planet. And also to D with the toolkit and helping bring down barriers. So how do we bring those kind of real tangible ways? So I think there's some great examples that were brought here today, and we all have a role to play in that piece around social license. So in closing, I just want to thank once again Ed and your team from the Public Policy Forum for coming here to Atlantic Canada and to bring your resources and create this conversation around immigration revitalization in our region. So thank you for that. Also, thank you to the sponsors. I'm not sure that that slide is there anymore. But again, sponsors are so important to making these events happen. For all the speakers that took the time to prepare, all the moderators, and of course to all of you for taking the time out of your schedule to be here. It's an honor to have this time to spend with you, and thank you for allowing me to close the day with you. So thanks for being here. I also want to mention that the Frank McKenna Awards reception begins at 5 o'clock, and it's right here. Is it in? Yeah, right in this area here. So we have time for a little bit of refresh, and then we'll see you back here this evening at 5 o'clock. So again, thanks very much for your time.